Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the series of lectures offered by Nile University on contemporary and important issues in our lives. I would like to welcome Professor James Robinson with us today. Dr. Hassan Ali, our Dean of the School of Business, will introduce him properly in a few minutes. But I would like to welcome him, and we appreciate him being with us tonight. I'd like also to welcome all the attendees, our Board of Trustees and our Board of Advisors, whom we have relied on quite a bit to provide guidance for Nile University. I'd like to welcome all the attendees on our Facebook channels. And this is one of the series of lectures that we have started actually post-COVID-19. And it seems like we have a new world post-COVID-19. All of us are starting to realize that, and we have called it under different names. I happen to call it World X.0, which is the new world and the future world. But there are many activities and many of our walks of life and the way we live and the way we work and the way we educate and everything is changing. And certainly also the way nations operate change. And our speaker tonight is one that is quite recognized with his former book, Why Nations Fail, which is one of the best sellers that ever hit the market. And he has now a new book that he introduces some of his new visions and ideas that we are very eager to listen to. So I really don't want to take time from our main speakers, but I would like to welcome everybody again. And we are delighted that you are joining us. And please, I will give the floor to Dr. Hassan Ali so he can introduce the speaker properly. Thank you, Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tariq, and welcome to all. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I have a lot of all the friends I'm seeing, which is an opportunity, as I told our Professor Heba Handousa. This is always a chance to see these friendly faces, and I'm very happy to see all of the group coming together. We have a variety of discipline included. We have also people from India, we have people from Europe, we have people from the US. So as I told the Professor Robinson, this is a tribute to his popularity part of the world. Professor Robinson doesn't need introduction. Actually, as Dr. Tariq mentioned, his book has turned things upside down in development economics and has been listed as bestseller for a number of years and has been translated to so many languages. And I'm sure that a lot of you heard about Why Nation Fails. And in Why Nation Fails, as I have sent a brief review of it, the question of why some nations are poor and some are rich were answered. In his current book, with the same co-author, Darren Asamoglu from MIT, both emphasize that in order to create an inclusive society, it's important to simultaneously build a strong state and a strong society. And this book is about that balance between the strong state and the strong society, where they basically make this balancing act in a very narrow space. And that's the name of the book, The Narrow Corridor. I'm not going to take more time because I know that Professor Robinson has things to do and he has to finish on time, and he has been teaching from the morning, actually. Remember, it's 12 o'clock in Chicago, and he has been teaching from 9 o'clock, so I don't want to put more burden on him. I will let Professor Robinson share the screen and start his presentation. In half an hour or so, we will move to the Q&A. Please, the floor is yours, Professor Robinson. I think you are still muted.
Great, yes. Okay, great. So thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me, and nice to see some old friends in Cairo. And it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be presenting today. I have to say, and let me share my screen. I want to make two remarks before I start talking about some thoughts about the COVID-19 crisis through the lens of the narrow corridor. I'm not really going to talk about my book. It'll only really come in right at the end. But it's, if you've read the book, it's sort of through the lens of the book. But before I get into this, I want to say two things. First of all, I've actually been avoiding, every economist, all my economist colleagues, they all have 3 or 4 papers each on the COVID-19 now. And I've been really strenuously resisting writing papers on COVID-19. And I think partly because, I'm a bit, remember the famous instance where Zhou Enlai, in the Chinese Communist Party was asked, I believe in the late 1960s, what he thought about the French Revolution. And what did he think were the implications of the French Revolution? To which he replied, it's too early to tell yet. So I feel, it's very hard to study for someone like me who kind of spends so much time sort of thinking about history. It's very hard to study something which is just moving so fast all around you. And it's a bit bewildering. It's not my usual style of doing research. So I'm finding it difficult to think about it. So instead I'm burying myself, in my office and trying to write a book about African developments. But you're forcing me to come out and talk about this. So I just like to say I'm doing this very reluctantly and possibly not very successfully. Okay. So here's my take on what's happening. And what I see as, it's a very, very interesting moment for somebody like me who's interested in political economy and state formation, because it's a very, very Hobbesian moment. It's a moment where, when Thomas Hobbes wrote his great book, Leviathan, it was the middle of the English Civil War. There was chaos, there was murder, there was a complete breakdown of the state and order. And Hobbes, what do people care most about? Security. They want security, just basic security. And Hobbes said, we need to provide an entity, a Leviathan, an all-powerful Leviathan that can do that. And, to use the language he used, people will be willing to sacrifice their wills, to give up their will to this thing for protection. And this moment has that element. It's very scary. You don't know how this is. The medical profession doesn't agree. Is this good? Is that bad? Is there going to be a vaccine? Is there not? How is it transmitted? Can you get it from children? Are people asymptomatic? There's huge uncertainty, and it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. So it's a very Hobbesian moment where there's a demand for the state to come and do things to protect you. But at the same time, it's a moment with sort of unprecedented levels of lack of trust in state institutions. So this is probably going to be a very US-centric presentation, which I'm rarely accused of giving. But I suppose I'm here and we're dealing all the time with what's going on in Illinois and President Trump. And so you forgive me for giving a take on the issues which are very Eurocentric, and I'm happy to try to take a go at reflecting on more global issues as we go on. I'll give some global examples, but I think a lot of my concerns are when I say, it's a historically low moment in the extent of trust that in the state. That's a statement. It's less true about Europe than it is, but it's very true about the United States. I was reminded, I put here on the slide, I was reminded of the famous expression of Ronald Reagan the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Okay, the 9 most terrifying words. But now you want the government to help, but you're in a situation where this is true. So here's data from the Pew Research Center that actually have been collecting a lot of extremely interesting information on people's attitudes towards the pandemic. Here's the percentage of people that trust the government in Washington. It's been on a downward slope. Before Reagan, of course, as Nixon, it collapsed during the Nixon administration. And it's been on the downward trend through Bush, through Obama, Clinton, it went up a bit, but the trend is severely downwards. Okay, so that, this creates, what I'm calling, whoops, it's almost a sort of, it's a contradiction. You desperately want the state to help, but you don't trust the state. So will you trust the state to do what's needed to help you or not? And that seems to me to be a very contradictory situation, okay? And I think that situation is almost exacerbated by the nature of the pandemic. Why is it that people don't trust the state? Well, I think, one of the reasons is that for the majority of people in the United States, they don't see the type of social mobility over the last 30 or 40 years that they've seen in the post-war period. Median wages have been stagnant. There's been this enormous increase in inequality. But think about the shock. The shock is great. Well, it's not great, but it's tolerable for people like me, okay? Highly human. I can move home. I can give my lectures on Zoom. I can isolate myself from the world. I have children, but I can afford to solve the problem of children who are out of school. I don't expose myself. No one's cutting my wages. I'm not going to be unemployed. But think about low-skilled people. They're in essential sectors. They have to go to work. They have to risk the virus. How do they deal with their children off school? There's just enormous different impact throughout the income distribution and the skill distribution, which has a huge impact on inequality, it seems to me. And poor people's children, they drop out of school. Rich people find substitutes. Poor people find that very difficult. This passes on to their children. So this is a very negative shock to inequality at a time of historically high levels of inequality. And I think it's a shock to social dislocation as well. My former colleague, Robert Putnam at Harvard, pointed out, I'm going to come back to that, pointed out the incredibly decline, the decline in civic engagement in his book, Bowling Alone. Of course, he's much more famous for his book, Making Democracy Work. But his book, Bowling Alone, is exactly about this. It's exactly about this declining trust in the government. And he pins this to this kind of erosion of solidarity and associational life in the United States, decline in what he calls civic engagement. Decline in the organizational forms, like trade unions, which eroded, which used to exist in the United States or even in England, and which eroded and came under serious attack during the Thatcher-Reagan period. So this is massively exacerbated by this, the decline of organizations of private, which have provided solidarity and associational life, and this shock isolates people in a kind of radically novel way, of which it's very hard to understand the long run consequences. So the nature of the shock makes this initial problem worse. This is just some evidence. I'm going to come back to this on what's going on in this country at the moment, which is absolutely frightening. Pharaoh freed the slaves during a plague. I thought I'd put that up there since, you're in Egypt, and, so Pharaoh freed the slaves during a plague, and who are these guys? Well, this is people not trusting the state, protesting the lockdown, turning up with their machine guns, outside the state capitol in Michigan. How about that? These are not people working for the government. They're they're concerned US citizens, let's say. Okay. So, and there's also some incredibly interesting data about the mental health consequences. So there've been surveys of people under lockdown. Of course, the lockdown is being relaxed now, but with the predictable consequences, given the incompetence of the government reaction, is now going to go into reverse because you see that the consequences. So there's severe mental health. This is a survey that the City University of New York did, a phone survey of people under lockdown in New York City. 40% felt anxious, 32% felt depressed, social isolation, so just to kind of emphasize this nature of this shock. Okay, so what's the consequence of that? I see very divergent outcomes from this, and since I'm an economist, and I'm an economics professor, I made up a little diagram. Okay, so and it's the interaction of two things. So think of the vertical axis as the increase in the responsibility that the state has to take on. Here in Illinois, now we can't move anywhere, so we're all trapped in our states, and suddenly it's a whole new world, so now, the governor and we have a president who's just has no policy, basically. He just doesn't know what to do, so he doesn't do anything. So the governor of Illinois and the mayor of Chicago has to do everything, and they're doing all these things that you could never imagine before. They're telling us you can't do this and you can't do that, and we're closing this, and you can't go here, and you can't go by Lake Michigan, and all the shops are closed, and they're just doing all these things that you could never imagine that they would be able to do. They have to take on all these responsibilities. That's what the doctors are telling them in order to stop the pandemic. So think of this dotted line as representing that's what the state has to do to stop this thing. This is what the epidemiologists say. You have to take on these responsibilities. But the question is, will people accept that? And that's what the red line is showing. So the horizontal axis is sort of saying the trust in the state. And the idea of the red line, which is increasing, is that, well, the more you trust the state, the more you're willing to allow it to take on these roles. Okay, Governor Pritzker, he's doing a good job. I voted for him. I kind of trust he's going to behave in our interests. He's not going to abuse these powers. Well, I don't know. Those people in Michigan don't look like they think like that. So the idea here is, think of X. X is a position where it's like the amount of trust in society which is just enough that people are willing to allow the state to take on these roles that it has to get the pandemic under control. So if you're to the right of X, you're in a good position. Actually, society trusts the state enough that they're willing to take on these roles, and they're willing to let the state take on these roles. So the state takes on these roles, the pandemic gets under control, the state does what it's supposed to do, people update and think, okay, the state's doing its job. It's a sort of it's a kind of virtuous circle. But if you're to the left of X, and that's what concerns me deeply about the United States at the moment, you're not willing to cooperate with the state. Here in Illinois, there's been staggering civil disobedience. The government closes the parks, the national parks, and they block up the car parks. What do? People park in the road, they park on the verges, and they just ignore, and they just go in the park anyway. So there's been mass civil disobedience. And, and Illinois is by far, that's not one of the worst states at all for this. So that you're to the left of X. There, you're not willing to trust the state to take on the roles it's supposed to. So then that's a disastrous situation, because then the state can't really deal with the problem, and then you lose even more trust because the state's not delivering on what it's supposed to. So this is when I say, it's a sort of divergent situation. It's a sort of, if you're in an equilibrium like Taiwan or South Korea, where people trust the state and the state responds, it gets it under control, or New Zealand, then this is a virtuous circle. But the US is really teetering on, in this other situation. Okay, so that's my diagram. Now you might say, well, this is a language which is tailored to talking about democracies. What about authoritarian regimes? They don't care about what people want or don't want, or what people think is legitimate, or what people will allow. They just do it anyway. The Chinese just do it. Yeah, maybe, but everybody needs legitimacy. Everybody needs, every type of state, every type of regime needs legitimacy. If the Chinese government thought, thought that people trusted it or were cooperating with it, they wouldn't spend so much resources censoring everybody left, right, and center. The amount of resources that the Chinese government allocates to repression and censorship shows that they don't actually think that people believe in the project. They have to monitor them and keep them under control. So I don't think, I don't think that this problem is solved just by authoritarian regimes. And in fact, in the world, maybe we'll talk about this. I have slides on this, but going forward, I think we can see there's going to be a very large contraction in various forms of globalization, which is going to have serious implications for the Chinese economy. Then the Chinese government can't legitimate themselves so much by delivering economic growth. So they have to legitimate themselves otherwise. So I'm sort of saying, I don't think authoritarian regimes are completely exempt from this calculus that I'm describing here, to be honest with you, quite the opposite. Okay, now you might say, hold on, this is a very pessimistic narrative here. Surely there's signs for optimism. Like, didn't good things come out of, Why Nations Fell, we talk about the Black Death, how the Black Death ended feudalism and serfdom in Western Europe. And so surely there can be good things. Can't a crisis bring people together and make people realize that it's a disaster, the healthcare system in this country, and we need more public goods, and this is a world pandemic. We need global institutions to coordinate our responses. I don't see that in the United States. I wish it were true. It makes sense logically, but here's some data, which is just absolutely mind-blowing about how Republicans and Democrats think. So this is people who answer that they're extremely concerned about coronavirus, okay? And here's the Democrats and here's the Republicans. This is a medical issue. It's a scientific issue. It's not a political issue. Like, this is just completely orthogonal. But this is what social psychologists would call motivated reasoning. Like, somehow you're processing this through your politics, and you don't see I don't see convergence. I don't see this happy scenario of people coming together and realizing, no, everyone is interpreting this in their own way. I mean, that's a statement about how polarized things are in this country now. But I don't see evidence for that consensus in the United States at all. Far from it. Okay. Now you might say, again, well, we're all in it together. Coronavirus, we're all in it together. It affects everybody. So isn't that a source of solidarity? Or, like there's very interesting research about the origin of social services. I have a picture here, probably what nobody will be able to understand it, but let me tell you what it says. It's from research by Werner Trusken, who was a brilliant young economic historian who died at a ridiculously young age. But he studied the origin of public good provision, public health, sewerage in this case, in US cities. And he showed that US cities where kind of black people and white people were all mixed up residentially, did much better at delivering sewage and kind of basic infrastructure to help people's health, because white people had the power to do it. And if black people lived near white people got it as well. And also, if black people lived near white people were worried about catching diseases from black people. So they were kind of happy to allow the infrastructure to serve black people. But if they were more segregated, like in Memphis on the left here, then the sewage, the infrastructure was just much less well developed. Okay, so this is, so could it be? I don't think that's true now either. Elites are more and more isolated in this country. They self-provide education, they self-provide healthcare. I think that in a part of that inequality, it's not just inequality of income. It's inequality in a kind of like a Latin American sense of just like radical social, isolation and people living in very different worlds. And I think, the shock has made this worse. It hasn't brought people together. It's locked them up in their homes and their houses, and it's isolated them even more. So I don't think that mechanism is happening either. Now, another argument that you hear, kind of more optimistic, is a sort of like the Nicaraguan earthquake. So probably you've heard this story about, here's General Somoza on the right, who's a very tall gentleman, but he was a dictator in Nicaragua. And there was a massive earthquake. You can see devastated Managua. In fact, if any of you have been in Managua, you'll know that they basically never rebuilt it. They just kind of moved the city. So the old center of Managua, still kind of devastated, was just left, and they moved away from the lake. And but what happened is that aid flowed in, and a humanitarian aid, and General Somoza and his cronies stole it all. And somehow it was a moment where it revealed the bankruptcy of the regime in Nicaragua. And if you want to know, why did Nicaragua have a revolution, and not Honduras or Guatemala or Salvador? It was because this brought everyone together, elites, non-elites. Everybody saw how incredibly bankrupt and corrupt the regime was. And that created the Sandinista revolution. That's one narrative. There were other things. But could it be like that? It just sort of reveals how disastrously dysfunctional many institutions in the United States are. And again, I apologize for talking about the United States, but you forced me to talk about this. So don't complain too much, okay? Maybe. I don't see that yet. I don't see it. Maybe that could happen. Maybe it can happen, but I don't see it yet. And I do see President Trump has just been, he doesn't know what to do. So there is a space for deliberation. There is a space for people to kind of seize the agenda because he can't, he's disappeared from the media also, which is just incredible. Like, he just disappeared. I mean, so, and here's an example I thought of when I was making up these slides. George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. In some sense, Black Lives Matter, it's just a sort of coincidence. it's just normal police brutality in this country, in the normal way that they repress minorities and African Americans. They repress them by imprisoning them, and ghettoizing them and murdering them with impunity. And it came at this very tense moment. And I honestly think that this is an issue which has more chance of bringing people together than COVID does. It reminded me of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, who famously, split the Democratic Party. He pulled off the northern part of the Democratic Party, in the late 1850s from the Southerners with this issue of slavery, basically, about whether states could declare slavery was illegal, whether Illinois could declare slavery was illegal. And he kind of split the party. So is this something that could split the Republicans, and it seems like there's more potential for this than even COVID-19, interestingly enough, although, the data is ambiguous anyway. Let me not dwell on that. Okay, so I'm anxious about not talking too long. I'm okay, 22 minutes. All right. So what do you do about this? Okay. Well, I think, I'm a positive political economist. So, I usually just think about why something's happening rather than, how could you make it better? Because even if you come up with an idea about how to make it better, how is that implementable, given the political constraints? And obviously there's policies, you'd think that healthcare policy would be, just the shocking state of healthcare, the fact that millions of people, the people who are going to be bearing the brunt of COVID-19 the most, do not have access to proper healthcare. At the University of Chicago Hospital, they'd be treated, but they'll come out owing tens of thousands of dollars in medical debts. In this country, after housing debt, unpaid medical debts is the largest source of debt in this country. There's billions and billions of dollars of unpaid medical debts. And don't think the University of Chicago is a charitable organization. They sell the debts to repo men who come and take your car and your TV, and they try to collect the money. It's the most sordid business you can ever imagine. So yes, there's obvious policies that could make this better. More social insurance. What's the figure? According to the PSID, the Panel Study for Income Dynamics, I believe that's where this number comes from. 60% of people in the United States couldn't find $400 if they needed it. Okay, so people live hand to mouth. What do you do if you're suddenly sent home into lockdown and somebody stops paying you? You're just completely illiquid. You have to rely on friends, on family, and so George Akerlof, the great Nobel Prize winner, George has this, amazing fact, which is the majority of Americans go to bed at night worrying about money. That's what they're thinking about in bed. They're worrying about money, and that's the $400. So there's very little social insurance, in this country. I mean, there's no nationally mandated health insurance, health leave, for example. Imagine you get sick, and then to what extent does your firm have to pay you, if you're ill while and there's no national legislation on that. It's all state level, it's ad hoc, it's all over the place. It's not inclusive. And so we could talk in abstract about social insurance, the need for social insurance, the need for healthcare, but in the meantime, the government is trying to abolish, the healthcare insurance of millions. The current Trump administration is trying to abolish the healthcare for millions of people, who will be hit by coronavirus. So how that adds up to being good politics is absolutely beyond me, but that's a statement about how polarized, we are in the United States at the moment. And of course, try to find ways to reverse the trends in social capital and that Robert Putnam pointed out. And, there must be creative technological solutions for that as well, it seems to me. But let me just end by talking about how this is connected to the narrow corridor. So you have this, in the narrow corridor, we have this idea that the secret to kind of developing a prosperous society is two things. It's both state, an effective state with capacity, and, this pandemic has revealed that many states lack very important sorts of capacity. This is a kind of unprecedented challenge, you could say. I mean, you could say maybe this was a challenge, during the Spanish flu, but it's not something that left a kind of persistent institutional imprint, or at least on any states that I know well. But so it's a challenge that the state was not designed to deal with, and the US state is a very sort of ramshackle thing for historical reasons, because of the way legitimate authority was built, in the period before the Constitution under the Articles of Confederation, which is an extremely decentralized system without an effective central state. And when they built a central state, it was built with a constitution in which many things were delegated to the states, where there were all sorts of institutions which were inserted, because of this distrust of power in some sense. Many of these checks and balances and the architecture of political institutions was designed to incapacitate, deliberately designed to incapacitate the federal state, because at the time there was an enormous concern that a strong national state would be enormously hostile to the interests of the political autonomy of the local state. That's where you got the Bill of Rights from. That's where you got the right to bear arms and many other things. So I think you have to see the kind of historicity of the US state, and the legacy that's left in many ways. The way the Supreme Court works in some sense is by law, is by triumphing the historicity, this obsession with kind of, with the original intentions of the fathers. And this is a challenge that state was not designed to cope with, and the kind of the incapacitation which was designed to solve this particular political problem. Now we see it has enormous costs. So in Why Nations Fail, we're relatively optimistic about the US institutions to cope with this, because we looked a lot at the 1930s, and things were very bad in the 1930s, and everyone remembers President Roosevelt, but everybody forgets President Hoover. President Hoover, it's a bit like President Trump, actually. He did a very, very bad job of responding to the Depression, and it took several years, before people understood the scale of the problem and how persistent it was, and so again, that's an optimistic scenario. I don't see that at the moment, but maybe I wouldn't have seen it if I'd been sitting here with President Hoover as president. But what we to go back to the narrow corridor, what we emphasize there is yes, you need this state with capacity, but you need a society which is strong too, which can control the state, which has confidence that it can control the state, and that the state grows stronger and society grows stronger kind of in harness, you know, in this corridor where they balance each other. And I think what's happened in the United States is, yes, love it, yes. What's happened in the United States is that equilibrium has become more and more shaky, you know, and I guess my diagram is to sort of emphasize, I'm concerned about that toppling over, you know, because society's become less convinced of its ability to control the state. The state has become more distant. Elites have become more distant. You know, there's very interesting work by Larry Bartels, who's a political scientist at Princeton, showing that if you look at the kind of policy preferences of US senators, they're much more in tune with policy preferences of elite people than they are with anybody like the kind of median voter, you know. So the political system has become more diverse from ordinary people, and people, I think, have lost confidence in its ability to deliver. So that's, in the terms of our book, that's this equilibrium, this balance between the state and the society getting out of balance, getting unhinged, and I think this shock creates a kind of dynamic that is very scary. And of course, in the book, you know, while we talk about like a lot of deep history and how is it that different parts of the world got into this balance between state and society, and why is it that other parts of the world, like China, you know, got into a very different equilibrium where the state dominates society, or other parts of the world, you know, you could say, you know, in Yemen, you know, or in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where society dominates the state, you know, where there's a kind of imbalance between state and society. You know, how do you get into this narrow corridor, and how do you get, you know, what happens if you leave it? And so I guess I'd say, you know, how would I think about this COVID-19, the COVID-19 shock in the context of our book? It would be, you know, this is a very worrying moment. If you're in a balance, you know, then maybe it creates this virtuous circle and you move on in the corridor and it kind of cements your position in the corridor. But if you're below X, as I say, that can tip you out of the corridor, okay? And you know, I end by just saying, you know, so we need to find new ways, innovative ways of getting people to trust, you know, that all of these powers that the state has to take on won't be abused, you know. And, you know, I think that speaking, you know, as a living in the United States or living in Illinois, I'm going to finish with an Illinois example. There's many ways, many changes that you could make in the United States, which would give people more confidence, you know, that power would not be abused. And here's an Illinois example to finish with. So for those of you who don't know Chicago politics, this is Illinois' 4th congressional district, you know, there's different ways of measuring this, but according to one way, this is the most gerrymandered congressional district in the United States. Okay, so this green thing is a congressional district. So what the heck is the logic of that? You know, why does it look like that? Well, I'll tell you why. It's to make sure that Hispanic people only elect one congressperson. So you just concentrate all the Hispanic people into one congressional district to make sure that they just only elect one Hispanic congressman. Sure enough, the congressperson is a Hispanic American. But this is flagrantly undemocratic. And the United States has never moved to a situation where, you know, these boundaries they're drawn in this ridiculously partisan way, and this reduces political competition. That's, you know, that's one of the points. It also reduces the representation of minorities. That's another point, and it's outrageous. And, you know, one could list many examples like this. You know, this whole controversy about postal voting at the moment, if you've read anything about what's going on in the United States. So let me stop there. I didn't talk too much about my book, but I thought it was more interesting just to kind of talk about my view about what's going on. And it's a fairly pessimistic view, but I keep thinking about Herbert Hoover. It must have been terrible when Herbert Hoover, you know, was in charge. And so, you know, that's I guess I can end on a note of optimism that after Herbert Hoover came FDR, and that was still a heck of a battle. You know, it was a heck of a battle to actually implement the New Deal. So,
thank you so much. Thank you, James.
Yes.
It's been very enlightening. We will open for Q&A, but I think we're going to take the first shot at the business faculty of Nile University questions.
Okay.
Since it was, I think you already answered quite a few of these, but I will have my colleague here share these Q&A, and it's basically 5 questions. Engineer Muhammad Abul Futuh collected them, and I just narrated the question here for everybody to see, and basically say that this narrow corridor, from reading the book, seems really narrow. You're talking about a really a very slim or a small space. So the question is this narrow enough to be non-pursual? Is pursuing this narrow corridor and the stable and the balance between the society and the authority is going to be very difficult to pursue. And the question is this is really over optimistic to have same kind of question that we ask when we've been talking about the natural resources. If the country doesn't have the natural resources, it's been doomed. Is the narrow corridor is kind of a doom, or how do you see this one? The second question talk about these delicate balance between the state and the society, and how easy the nation may slip out of the narrow, and how hard for it to go back. The question number 3, we're going to pose them all together, and then you can take a stab at it at once. Okay. You look at the Western society as example, as we just mentioned, the US, and then you realize that with the Black Lives Matters and the like, it's not really what we have thought it is. You know, people has been struggling for hundreds of years now, and they are in the end. It's deep-rooted to the degree that Trump did not invent it. Trump just revealed it. He really appealed to the worst human instinct, and that's why it is there. So how this is related to the narrow corridor balance. The next one, question number 4, talks about this the hoppus and the shackled metaphor that you have used. In a sense, why this struggle between the liberty or the citizen, what he considered liberty? You show the picture of the people armed who are on Illinois State House, and even in the street where they were threatening the demonstrators, and how this is going to balance with the government just trying to do its act, just trying to control itself. This really, again, leading to a major conflict that cannot be resolved. The last question, number 5, is again talking about the same issue, where somebody quoted Jennifer Aniston that they are worried about taking their rights. I remember Ronald Reagan talking about the government being the problem rather than the government solving the problem. Are we away from this notion? Is Trump bringing this notion again? Is he really succeeding in following the Reaganomics that, in a sense, has made the US one of the worst unequitable country on the face of the globe? And last question, this is from me. I just want to take your take on the election based on what you have seen and Democratic concern versus the Republican concern, which is very interesting graph, Jem, that you have put there. What's your? I know that you are not very much in the forecasting business, but how do you think this will going to impact the election that's coming in November? Thanks. You can go ahead, please.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of how narrow is the corridor, the big picture, which we talk about towards the end of the book, if you thought about the modern world, the corridors got much wider, like many, if you thought historically, many institutions like slavery, slavery and forced labor, various systems of servile labor were extremely common, in the world until the last 100, 200 years. And so there are big changes, I think. You know, the world is more democratic, albeit imperfectly. There are big changes which kind of make the corridor wider, I think, from that perspective. And, you know, of course, there are countries that have got into it, that have made the transition. So I don't think, you know, I think that's the big picture. I don't know if the corridor is narrowing now or not. I don't really have a view on that, you know, but I do think, you know, there's enormous path dependence. You know, I don't think, you know, that, you know, if you look at the history of China, you know, China has been out of the corridor for a very long time. And, you know, the idea that some economic growth and some sort of modernization was going to turn China into a liberal democracy, I find kind of ludicrous. You know, it flies in the face of everything we know about Chinese history and Chinese society and the whole kind of, so that's not the social contract in China, and it's kind of never been. It's just, so that, you know, that's, so I think that's a good thing. Or like, think about Yemen. You know, I gave this example of Yemen. You know, what we know about Yemen is that, you know, it's been like that for a long time. You know, that wasn't created yesterday. It's, you know, we know quite a lot about the history of Yemen, and that's a very persistent, very stable equilibrium, you know, and so I do think that's very hard to sort of solve. You know, it's very hard to build legitimate kind of institutions and kind of exit from that trap in, you know, from that situation in Yemen. And it's very hard to kind of move China away from that equilibrium too. So I think, you know, I think the corridor's there, but the transitions, you know, are difficult to make for some sorts of societies. And so I you know, I would say it's getting bigger over time, not narrower, but it's still, the problem is still, there's still a lot of persistence in the world. You know, how easy is it to slip out of? So you know, like I talked about, you know, I'm very concerned about the dynamics of the US, you know, but here's what I think would happen. I mean, so there's a lot of persistence in the world. And, you know, for example, when we talk about Europe and how did Western Europe get into this corridor, that's a very deeply rooted, you know, we go back 1,500 years to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, you know, where this sort of balance emerges. Now, there's a lot of stuff has happened since then. And we talk about Germany, you know, you could say, well, Germany, you know, for a long time was in the corridor, then it veers out of the corridor, you know, then it comes back in, and then it veers out again and it comes back in. So I'm not sure that I understand, this is just sort of, I'd say like, this is a kind of empirical regularity. I'm not sure that I really understand as a social scientist what mechanisms are at work here. But, you know, I think Bourdieu, if you know, read any of what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would have said, he said it's something about like the habitus, you know, like think about Germany, you know, so, you know, you have this notion of representation, you have estates, you have participation, you have, it collapses after the 30 Years' War, you know, and this absolutist state building project appears. You know, but the absolutist state building project is somehow a kind of anachronism. It lasts, it's a pretty long anachronism. It collapses in 1806 at the Battle of Jena. You know, then the old institutions bounce back, and, you know, I could tell, you know, and that goes right way through to the, you know, to Weimar, the Nazi state collapse. The Germans go right back to doing things. That's habitus. That's the way they do things in Germany. That's the way the Germans do things. Now, but of course, that example is frightening because it says, you know, that the Nazi state was an aberration. It was an aberration, but it was an aberration that created enormously negative consequences for human society, you know. So I would say, you know, what's the possibility in the US of crashing out of the corridor? I think it can happen. I think it can happen. I don't think it will last very long, but it can create chaos and misery, you know, even if it only lasts 10 or 20 years, you know, I mean, I don't think it's going to start another world war like the Nazi state did, but it could create a civil war. It could create a civil war. It could create a sort of instability that's like unimaginable to previously unimaginable. So I think that's how we try to talk about this. There's a sort of, you know, there is this persistent, but you can be thrown out of the corridor by these shocks. But I think what history shows is that it's much easier for a society that was once in the corridor to kind of get back into it than a society which has never been in it to get into it. the US, I think, and we talk a lot about this in chapter 10 of the book, where we start by talking about this Ferguson, Missouri, and how did Ferguson, Missouri become this place, and this was a place where we were previously, talking about racial discrimination and where the police force basically became a protection racket for shaking down African Americans, and finding them arbitrarily. I mean, it's absolutely shocking, the story. So I think, here's the way I've always thought about the US. I've studied Latin America a lot. I teach every summer in Colombia. I spent many years in Colombia. And when I compare like a place like Colombia or Peru, to the United States, I always think they both faced very similar problems 200 years ago, 250 years ago. They had all this kind of open space. They had to control it. They had to build modern institutions. They had to create and the US did a heck of a better job of it than the Colombians, and the Peruvians and the Brazilians. They did a heck of a better job, but it was a very imperfect job. Absolutely. Is that an imperfect job compared to what the Swedes did or the Dutch or the Norwegians? Absolutely, but the problem was a heck of a lot harder. The Swedes never had to solve this problem of how do you deal with this diversity? How do you project power over this massive space in a way that can't be abused? And so I think that challenge, and it came with this legacy, slavery. The Constitution is just full of all these dirty deals over slavery, and they didn't have to deal with that in Sweden. In fact, in the Middle Ages in Sweden, they had a parliament, with representation of the peasants. How about that? So that's a very different history. So it's much easier to build a kind of much more inclusive society with that history than it is in the US. But I agree with you. Yeah, that there's enormous problems. I remember when I came here as a student from England, I was just horrified. I was horrified at the level of exclusion. And just like, and of course I got used to it after a bit, which is talking of habitus. But anyway, so I think that's how things are, and there's just a lot of challenges and there's a lot of problems. And I agree with you. What we're learning is that the US project has been very good at some things, but it's absolutely failed in other dimensions. Yeah. And
anything about the election, Jim?
I think I just don't know what's going to happen. The election frightens me, honestly, because if President Trump loses a close election, he's never going to accept it. He's going to claim that it was fixed. I mean, let's face it, the majority of Americans voted for Hillary Clinton, but because of this archaic electoral college, Donald Trump is president. But most Americans, how about that for a political system? So if it's close, there's going to be a danger of terrible instability. And I'm going to say something which I never thought. I've been living in this country for over 30 years, and here's something that I never thought I would say. It depends on what the military does, honestly.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it does. It does. Look at that business at the church in Washington, D.C. The military, it's up to the military to deal with this problem. It's absolutely frightening. That's how bad things are here. Yeah.
All right. They do apologize, I believe, afterward.
Yes, they did. The Joint Chiefs of Staff apologized. Yes.
Okay. Well, I have a lot of people who wants to ask questions, but I wanted to greet one particular audience who is coming from Brazil. Carla is from Brazil, sending her greetings. So I wanted just to acknowledge her presence with us. So you have the 5 continents represented in this forum.
Amazing.
James, we have Dr. Tariq Khalil and then Dr. Hussam Badrawi asking question. Dr. Tariq, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan, and thank you, Jim, for a wonderful presentation. As usual, wonderful thoughts. I have a few just quick questions. You mentioned there has been a US failure of healthcare and of research in biotechnology and so on. And this was projected 20 years ago. I mentioned that in a seminar I gave just a week ago about World X.0, because there were predictions of what the disasters, natural disasters, environmental degradation and things of that nature, as well as viruses and so on. Is it a failure of government, or is it a failure of institutions, or is it a combination? And that's one issue. The second issue, now you're talking about the US, and you're talking about probably the loss of social cohesion that's probably starting to appear. Now, in many of the developing countries and so on, there's a very large informal economy, and people depend on a day-to-day work to survive and so on. And the states even have a limited resources. They don't even have the luxury of the things that the US has and so on. US at least has a social net, at least social security of some sort. You can see the unemployment claims that are coming up, which are huge and so on. Obamacare may have helped a little bit and so on. How would the developing nations that don't have the know-how or the resources, how would that affect the social cohesion in your opinion, and the corridor in there?
Yeah. Oof. Do I answer one at a time? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I think, I mean, obviously you're right, that experts predicted that these things could happen, with all of these SARS and, these viruses jumping from bats, Ebola. I think this is well understood by scientists that, this has happened before in human history. It could happen again, and it could be a lot worse than Ebola, not more deadly, but easier to transmit. And that's, I don't know. I think democracy. I think it's about democracy. I mean, it's about the prioritization of resources by the people in the control of the state. I think it's mostly about that, and about the short-sightedness of democratic decision making. I mean, I think that's. I mean, I think any kind of political system is very imperfect. And this is a weakness of this democratic model of decision making. This is a big this is something you have to invest in. It may not happen in 5 years, it may not happen in 10 years. And so you have to invest in that. You have to use resources that you could use for other things that might make you more popular when you get reelected. And I think it's probably as simple as that, that more attention placed on more immediate things. That's, but I guess, my view about democracy is, yeah, it's like Winston Churchill. It's the worst system except for all the alternatives, but it's bound to be, there's bound to be failures, and there's bound to be mistakes. And of course, this turns out to be one with enormous consequences, which were hard to conceive. I think the developing countries, I don't know. I mean, it's a little frightening, the consequences of this, how they can hit developing countries, with so little resources and so little ability to, just even this business of washing your hands how do you wash your hands all the time when there's no running water, So I think this is a disaster. It's a disaster for developing countries. It's a challenge that they don't have the health system to cope with it. They don't have, and as you say, how can you tell people to just stay at home when you're working in the informal sector, when you're eating in the evening what you make in the day? So my US example pales into comparison to the challenges that people face in developing countries. So I'm not sure I have anything deep to say about that, other than it's a humanitarian crisis.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hossam Badrawi, and then Dr. Ahmed Galal.
Professor, it's a pleasure to listen to you. I have two simple questions. What are the factors affecting the width of this corridor in any society? You mentioned the balance between the state and the society. And when the state is inefficient and the society is very poor and ignorant, How can this balance be achieved? And the second thing is that you scared me, frightened me when you said it might be back to the military in the United States to control what is expected from President Trump if the elections are close. Because this means that what we see in the developing countries are a result of natural development, and we should not complain.
You should not, Dr. Hussein.
No, I thought, you know, you'd be used to that. You'd be used to, in Egypt, you're used to the military deciding things, aren't you? Or you're used to worrying about what the military intends to do. I mean, I sort of think, you know, well, as a social scientist, I'd say, you know, that just shows that all this nonsense about US exceptionalism is nonsense. You know, that this is a society made up of human beings with, you know, the same kind of attitudes and problems and issues that any other society of human beings has. You know, like, I mean, that's kind of our methodological view. There's nothing different, you know, everybody in the human beings kind of for a first approximation. Of course, cultures differ and social norms differ and you know, but they're more or less the same all over the world. And that means that, you know, something that could happen in Egypt could easily happen in the United States or some, you know, and there's no, of course, history is important, but there's no reason why, you know, a prosperous, technologically dynamics, there's no reason, fundamental reason why, you know, the US managed to create a kind of more prosperous, technologically dynamic society than the Colombians did, you know, or the Algerians did. You know, that's just, it's about institutions, it's about politics, it's about history and shocks and about people, innovation, and you know, it's just that could easily have been the other way. You know, it could easily have been that the US would have been poor and the Colombians were rich, you know, or Egypt and you know was rich and Sweden wasn't, you know. Or, you know, think about Norway. I always think, you know, when I was debating a lot with Jeffrey Sachs, I always used to say, well, if Norway was a poor country, you'd easily be able to come up with a lot of geographical explanations for that, you know. So I don't think there's anything fixed about the world distribution of income or prosperity, and it could look very, very different. You know, histories could be different. If history had been different, it could be different. So I think that kind of fits in with my view of social science. You know, like that at some level we're all facing the same kind of problems. Egyptians and Brazilians and Americans and English people. You know, we're facing the same challenges, you know, to build a prosperous and inclusive society. And the US has done a better job than many parts of the world in the last 200 years, but there's no reason it won't come off the rails. You know, why nations fail, we have lots of examples of that. You know, Venice was probably the most prosperous part of the world in the late Middle Ages, and then it went completely into reverse. It oligarchized, you know, it abolished all the institutions that had made it rich, and it became a museum, you know. So why not, you know? So that's, you know, there's nothing. That's human history, I think. I mean, I think like with the corridor again, I think there are fundamental things about the modern world. Think about rights, like the notion of rights, you know, human rights or people's rights. You know, I think that's intellectual innovation, if you like, you know, but I think that has a massive effect on what sort of society you can create, you know, like, to what extent can you exploit people or oppress people? Or, well, we have language. I think that's powerful. It's powerful having a language to kind of express what's going on and kind of make people agree collectively that this is an unsatisfactory situation. So, you know, we talk about this in the book, about labor oppression, about rights, about different things, I think, that make the corridor wider today, you know, but you know, that's to discuss. Yeah. Sorry, I talked too much.
Not at all. We'll move because we don't have enough time. I think we're going to wrap in 5 minutes. So Khalid Eid has a question. He is my partner in crime here organizing this session.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Thank you, Dr. Robinsonthe, for this interesting lecture. Actually, my question, I think your argument is very interesting and is definitely bringing some very important questions and food for thoughts. However, I think the framework that the book is based on has two main dimensions. One is the inclusiveness of the political parties, and the other one is the inclusiveness and the power of the societal institutions. I think this framework could be applied very clearly in certain countries, but in other countries, there might be other factors like informal powers, terrorism, for example, in some countries, and fragmented societies, like the case of Lebanon, for example. So how do you see this framework from the perspective of the narrow corridor in these societies or countries? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, so it's very simplistic, as you're pointing out, to talk about society, for example. You know, that society can be very fragmented, and but so so here's the way. So we try to talk about that. So particularly in the Indian case, for example. So you could say Indian society is fragmented into all these castes, with mutually very antagonistic perquisites and rights and spheres of authority and influence and religious duties and so I guess the way we try to talk about it is eroding that or changing that as part of what it means for society to become strong. That society to become strong, you have to define collective projects and to organize collectively, and to do that through organization and social capital. And it's a strong society is a society where these things that you're talking about would erode and kind of coalesce into something different. So we try to give empirical examples in the book. I think that's true in Western Europe. Charles Tilly, the great sociologist, actually wrote a fantastic book about that in Britain, about exactly that. And so I think that's how we try to think about it. But so a very fragmented, we'd say that as in terms of a kind of weak society. But you're right that the conceptual framework, doesn't do a fantastic job of dealing with those sorts of issues, though we do try to talk about it in the book.
Excellent. Very good. I think we are wrapping up. I would like to really thank Professor Robinson for accepting our invitation. And you have one on me. I am delighted if you come to Cairo anytime soon to invite you to one of your favorite places here on the Nile, and it's on me. I'll see you in Chicago probably before you come.
I would love to come to Cairo. Yes. Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. I thank all our guests, and I really acknowledge the help that I got from our business school colleagues and the people who are in the board of trustees and the committee that organized this session. This is the last session in the spring term, and we're going to start the summer with a new lecture by Mr. Ashraf Musa Sabri, who is the founder of Fawry, the famous fintech. It's going to be on the 14th of July, and we'll be announcing it very soon. Thanks to my colleagues who came to see Jim. And thank you, Jim, once more. And hopefully I'll see you in the US very soon. Thank you very much.
Okay, be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for a wonderful presentation. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you in Cairo soon.
Fabulous. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.